Hello. Today we're talking about schizophrenia. I think more people should know about schizophrenia. It's probably the most debilitating disorder that we have, or that we'll talk about all semester. So many people with symptoms of this end up in the hospital and frequently are not functional afterwards. So I have a lot to share with you about schizophrenia. I hope you read about it and I hope you find it interesting. Worked a second ago, so let me try it again. Okay, so some of the history of schizophrenia. Philippe Pinel was a guy in France who first went to people in his community back in the 1800s, late 1700s, and asked to let people out of their prison cells. Basically, they locked up people in prison who were so unusual or had symptoms that people didn't understand. And he asked to treat them kindly. Talked about this in the history of disorders in like chapter 1 or 2. And he had good success with treating people humanely who had symptoms other people didn't understand. But he was also one of the first people to describe the symptoms of schizophrenia. A person later on came up with the term dementia praecox, which is a band I saw a long time ago. But that's basically what dementia, you know what dementia is. And then praecox means precocious, like happening early. So it was originally thought that perhaps it was an early onset of dementia. But Emil Kraepelin was another famous researcher and practitioner at that time in the late 1800s who identified the different subtypes of schizophrenia. And Franz Bleuler actually coined the term schizophrenia, which literally broken into its pieces means split mind. And that's unfortunate because it became associated with split personalities, which is not what it meant. It really instead means split from reality. And what he described as split functions of the mind, but it is not the same as split personality. So I'm having a hard time forwarding the slides without having that bar up there. As you know, what we're using for DSM-4 in our textbook is different from what is currently used in the United States. In the new DSM-5, they have eliminated the distinction between bizarre and non-bizarre delusions. So I'm going to describe delusions as being false beliefs. Basically, if they're false, they're false. That's all that matters. There is a new requirement about the symptoms you have to have in order to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. You have to have at least 2 of the specified symptoms. One of the 2 must be either delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized behavior. And all the subtypes were gotten rid of. They really didn't do much in terms of helping to diagnose or even chart a course for what the symptoms would look like over time. Right, so I'm going to just do that bar then. So the different types of symptoms that we have include sets of symptoms that they call positive symptoms. And they don't mean that as pleasant or good or a positive thing. It just means that you're like a plus sign, you're adding new behaviors onto a person's typical set of behaviors. And they include things like delusions, false beliefs. Delusions of persecution are most common, believing that the FBI, CIA, somebody's following you, somebody's get after you. Delusions of reference are also common. That means thinking that other people are referring to you. Even on TV, you watch newscasters and you think they're sending you secret messages. Delusions of grandeur, which is like this belief that you have been put on this earth for a special purpose and you are more special than other people and you can be some sort of savior or some sort of path to the future for the entirety of humanity. And then also false beliefs about control, that other people controlling your thoughts, that this is a scary one, that your thoughts are being broadcast to everyone, everywhere, so everyone knows what you're thinking, and that other people trying to insert thoughts in your heads or remove thoughts from your head. I start here with this positive symptom. I ask you to think about how really distressing it would be if you firmly believed these sorts of delusions. It would be hard to function. It'd be hard to go to school. It'd be hard to stay in a classroom. It'd be hard to go to work. If you really believed that other people heard your thoughts, or that your thoughts were being removed, that people were out to get you and that you were scared. So that's one of the big positive symptom sets. Another positive symptom set is hallucinations. And hallucinations, oh, that looks like it's moving, doesn't it? Are false sensory perceptions. So you think about your 5 basic senses, seeing, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. That hallucination is having a perception of something that's affecting your senses when there's no stimulus there. So auditory hallucinations are by far the most common. You hear voices that other people do not hear. What they've discovered with functional MRIs, that when a person is actually actively having auditory hallucinations, that the part of the brain responsible for speech production is receiving a lot of blood flow. So it's maybe basically what's considered to be sublingual self-talk, except the person who's doing that doesn't realize that the voices are coming from inside their head instead of outside their head. Yeah, and typically the frontal lobe of our brains determines where sound is coming from, but when a person is in an MRI machine with this, that part of the brain is quiet. There's also visual hallucinations, seeing people, seeing shadow figures. Sometimes the tactile are not real common, but they can feel like ants are crawling on your skin, or burning or tingling. Sometimes flavors are strange, and then smell is also not a very common one, but it's another part of the hallucination. So please be aware of the difference between hallucinations and delusions. Delusions are false beliefs, and hallucinations are false sensory perceptions. There are also disorganized symptoms, so the disorganized thinking and speech. I will post some videos of interviews of people with disorganized speech. I'd like you to think about basically ideas that we have here include word salads. I don't have that up on the slide, but that basically you think the ingredients of a salad being like lettuce and cheese and tomatoes and cucumbers, you toss them all up and make a salad, all comes together. That's kind of what happens to a person's words in a sentence. You take all the words in what might be a coherent sentence, toss them in the air, where they fall, that's how they come out. It sounds like gobbledygook. There's just no rhyme or reason to what's coming out of a person's mouth. A lot of times I put a derailment, train derailment, but like that, you start off on a topic and then you start going this way and this way and this way, and suddenly you're way out in left field. And you're like, wait a minute, I know where you started, but I don't know how you got to where you're at. So rapid shift in topics is common. And the person doesn't realize they're not making sense. Sometimes they make up new words. Sometimes they repeat their own words. Sometimes they rhyme. So with like clang, if you have to say the word clang, rang, dang, sang, bang, tang, that would be an ongoing clanging symptom. It's very disorganized. Also, some of the disorganized symptoms include movement, moving around a room with no like goal-directed behavior. It's just kind of aimless wandering that can happen. So that's also considered to be like disorganized behavior. There can be heightened perceptions where it's difficult to filter out incoming stimuli. There have been some, it's talked about in your book, that some argue that schizophrenia could be a disorder of cognitive processing, in particular of working memory, which is called short-term memory. And that most of us, as we have perceptions come into our visual field or our ears, we can direct our attention, I point here because it's the frontal lobe, to where we want to attend to, select that, and try to understand it while filtering out the other stuff. Some psychologists have argued that perhaps one of the things going on with schizophrenia there's no attention direction, that a person's unable to direct it. So it feels like all the stimulations coming in and everything's given equal time and equal priority, which would be really difficult to manage all that stimulation coming in at once. So when I put up here a study asking people with and without schizophrenia to pick out a syllable amongst background noise. When the background noise was low, performance was the same. When background noise was really high, people with schizophrenia had a hard time filtering out that background noise and hearing the syllable that was being said in the background. Also, another symptom is inappropriate affect, shifts in mood, laughing when laughing is not appropriate, or crying when crying is not appropriate. Those are additional symptoms that you might see. If we have positive symptoms, then we're going to have the negative sign. So think about a negative sign in front of a number. You subtract that number. And negative symptoms are the same thing. You have a person who might be going to school, might be going to work, having friends. Suddenly you start subtracting things that you would expect that person to behave in. That would include a lack of hygiene, where they stop showering, they stop brushing their teeth, they stop changing their clothes. I put up here a lack of poverty, a lack of speech. They say very little. They go from perhaps being quite talkative to being really quiet. Flat or blunted affect. And so when I say flat affect is like your emotional expression on your face, but you like, and there's no emotional expression on the face. Now, what's been indicated in the research, the people with flat affect and this negative symptom, they will have bodily responses going on, but it's just not coming out their face, which is from the reports, people having that symptom say it's very uncomfortable because they want to be able to communicate to other people better. So a lot of these things you may see has the prefix a, so like alogia, which is a lack of words. And then we have avolition. So if you have volition, you have a drive, but avolition, you subtract that drive and it's just lethargy and lack of motivation, tired. And the question is it because the person's scared of all these voices they're hearing? Are they just worn down? They're usually socially withdrawn. Other people don't understand them. They have a hard time having themselves be understood. And I also seen interviews with people with this disorder who have a really hard time keeping track. Like if they're trying to watch like the news on TV, it's too much to track. Sometimes you have motor problems, that strange movements, like put hair toward, I don't have much hair, but like toward my hair with fingers. They had catatonia, which is kind of like a freezing. There's a picture in your book where they pose people like Gumby dolls, and they stayed that way, which I don't know why they would do that. This is a slide that you will have on Canvas. It just goes through those symptoms that I walk through with a little more detail. These are the old subtypes. I'm not going to spend time with them. I just wanted to indicate that they were gotten rid of with the new DSM-5. This is a slide I do want to attend to because it goes through all sorts of psychotic disorders. So again, psychosis is about a break with reality. Schizophrenia is what we've been mainly focusing on so far. Brief psychotic disorder is basically very much like schizophrenia, except it's less than a month. And then this is all broken down in terms of time. As you can see, a person can start if they have these symptoms and then be diagnosed with brief psychotic disorder. If they have it between 1 month and 6 months, it'd be called schizophreniform disorder. But if it goes away between then, they're left with that diagnosis. If it extends beyond 6 months, we are talking about full-blown schizophrenia. So I have not really differentiated that too much. It's kind of like acute stress disorder and PTSD in some degree. There's also schizoaffective, which is having both. So you think affect being mood, you have symptoms of schizophrenia and then a mood disorder, schizoaffect disorder. Here I put, I told you they stop distinguishing bizarre and non-bizarre delusions. But in delusional disorders, you have some delusions, but you're not having all the other symptoms of schizophrenia. Let's see, do I want to talk about any of these others? Yeah, there are some breaks with reality that can happen because of brain damage or even imbalance of electrolytes. A medical condition can happen. And then sometimes just street drugs can cause symptoms that look a lot like schizophrenia. The overall prevalence, it's indicated a little less than 1%, about 1 out of every 140 people. It is definitely the most costly of all disorders because of the hospitalizations and the lack, I mean, the amount of family energy and time devoted to trying to care for a family member with this disorder. About a third of people with this attempt suicide, and 15% succeed. If you look at it, you see people in poverty are much more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than people in middle class or upper class. And the question is, what causes what? Is it that the stresses of being poor, like just add so kind of like that diathesis stress model, just adds so much that a person who's vulnerable to schizophrenia starts displaying symptoms? Or is it the person could start up in the upper middle class, but because of their symptoms, they lose their job, they stop paying rent, they get evicted from their apartment, and they start what's called a downward drift, that they become less and less successful. And that's probably the most likely scenario when you try to figure out this class schizophrenia relationship. If you look at it, males have it a little more frequently than females, and males develop between typically the ages of 20 and 24. But they also, women have more cases later on in life. Males have more negative symptoms, but they're equal on positive symptoms. Also, if you look here at marital status, people who are divorced or separated are much more likely, or single, much more likely to develop it. And it's thought largely probably because it's a lack of social support. If married, that percent is lower. This is just a slide showing kind of like how a person might have this downward drift because you're having all these things go on, like again, thinking impairment that leads to problems in, again, paying rent or paying car payment, having attitudes that other people don't understand, and basically drifting down socioeconomically. Strange though, again, this is a bar graph showing the percent of people in different classes that are diagnosed with this. You see more schizophrenia among people who live in cities, those who immigrate. Weed smoking at an early age and early adolescence is associated with it. If I had a child, I would, we don't have a family history of schizophrenia, but if we did, I would make sure my child knew the risks of that, because there's a clear connection now. That when that critical time, when you get myelinization between like the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, if that's compromised in any way with anybody who has vulnerability, schizophrenia, you're asking for problems. And for some reason, people whose fathers are older when they were born have a little higher risk too. This is an interesting graph. Basically, what you see here, I would like you to look at the very top two lines. And this is like looking at, and this study is described in your book. Developed countries are considered to be countries that have thriving economies, doing really well, like the G8, the big countries with the booming economies. And then the purple are more developing countries that struggle more with just being able to have an infrastructure that is solid and available to everyone. But if you look at how well people do with schizophrenia in developed countries versus developing countries, what you see is that there's more complete remission. That means it goes away with people who are diagnosed in developing countries. I mean, they have like 2/3 of people in developing countries who have schizophrenia have complete remission, whereas only about 1/3 in like US and Western Europe do. So, and if you look at hospitalization, much more common in developed countries like the US. A lot of theorizing about this. It looks to be that if you're in a developing country, there is more put on the family and the community to look after people in the community who may have a hard time either fitting in or being functional. And so a space is created that, okay, we know your neighbor down the street might act kind of in ways you wouldn't expect or don't understand, but we can still have room for this person and find them something to do so they feel productive, and make sure they're getting food, make sure they're being, and it's not that like, oh, they're having hallucinations, delusions, get them in the hospital, make sure they get meds, and then we don't have to worry about it, which is what happens more in industrialized countries. So if you look at the different rates of what's happening here, these charts here are pretty telling. I just want to mention there are different phases of the development of schizophrenia. The prodromal is kind of the before, then the active and after. And each phase can last days or years. Yeah, just, and a lot of times the prodromal phase, the early stages, you're seeing a little more negative symptoms and social withdrawal than anything else. Schizophrenia has been called a class of disorders because of the path in which it takes. This first top graph indicates that a person could have one basic episode of hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and then no impairment afterwards. And that's about 1/5 of the people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia. And this next one, a little over 1/3 of people who have symptoms of schizophrenia will peak. The symptoms will go away. They will return. They'll go away. They'll return. They'll go away. So that's just repeated. So it's like, is this a different form of schizophrenia? Some in group 3, and it's about 8%, they have their first episode, but they never get back to returning to normal functioning, the baseline. And they may have repeated episodes, but never return to their original level of functioning that they had when they first developed symptoms. And some just get worse over time. About 1/3 get worse and worse and worse over time. So it does seem almost like there's different sets of disorders going on with this one thing that we call schizophrenia. So up there, is it a family of disorders? I just walked through this slide for you. What are the causes? There's a lot of research on genes. If you look, actually, at Wash U in St. Louis, they were involved in the Human Genome Project, trying to map what actual genes can contribute to certain symptoms of schizophrenia, and they got it mapped out to being able to predict what type of like hallucinations a person would have, whether they have auditory hallucinations or visual hallucinations. There is strong genetic evidence suggesting that that's one of the major influences on developing schizophrenia. We know if you have an identical twin who has schizophrenia, the odds that you're going to have is about 1 in 2, so about 50-50, 48%. Also, if both your parents have schizophrenia, the odds that you're going to have it about the same. So we know that's possible. Let's see. What forward through that. Oh, here's another graph trying to illustrate some of the numbers for if you have a first cousin with schizophrenia, what the odds you're going to develop it. Again, if you're the offspring of 2 parents with schizophrenia or identical twin. We know that there's an interaction between environment and biology. If you have like what's called communication deviance, where the communication in a household or family is vague, confusing, perhaps demanding, not clear. If you combine a high genetic risk for schizophrenia with high communication deviance, there's going to be problems. And so basically, what's strange is if you have no genetic risk, and then you have either communication deviance or no communication deviance, you have no problems at all. But if you have low CD, even if you have a genetic risk, they do well. So there is an interaction between this environment and the genetics that we've been talking about. Through that, like I mentioned here about the use of weed as an adolescent. There's other psychological factors contributing to it. What we know about self-fulfilling prophecy, if a person is led to believe this is your diagnosis, this is who you are, sometimes there is a belief, oh, okay, then this is what's expected of me. And it may not even be conscious, but it's like, but then acting in ways that are consistent with the way you believe a person with schizophrenia acts. Sorry. One of the things we know though about people who have been diagnosed and returned to their family situations, if there is a high level what's called expressed emotion, And that means kind of an enmeshment. And there's a lot of like getting into a person's space, violating their boundaries, telling them what to do, acting like they're stupid, being critical, being hostile, and just being overly involved. That is a recipe for disaster for a person who's trying to recover from their symptoms of schizophrenia. It's called expressed emotion. That seems like a weird name, because I think generally expressed emotion is a good thing. If you express your emotions, you're getting it out there so you can talk about it. But this was used as a phrase to describe this sort of family environment, which is not good for a person returning to a home environment with high levels of expressed emotion. It could trigger cortisol release, which affects all sorts of neurotransmitters and hormones. Um, and what we have is that in developing countries, they don't have quite the level of expressed emotions. There's also evidence to indicate that dopamine is playing a bigger. It is not exactly clear of what's happening here. So it's thought that schizophrenia results from an excess of activity of dopamine, and maybe even like the D2 dopamine 2 receptors are too sensitive. And it was accidentally discovered that thorazine, which is a phenothiazine drug, which is originally being used as an allergy medication, and it was given to people with allergies who had schizophrenia, that their symptoms of schizophrenia went away. It's like, whoa, and it reduced the level of dopamine. But what we know is that dopamine is a link within a chain. If you think about a chain, because the meds act immediately on dopamine, so it removes that dopamine pattern of activity right away. But it takes a period of days to a week or so for the effects of the reduced dopamine activity to result in a decrease in the symptoms of schizophrenia. Also, what we know, meth and also other amphetamines, that increases dopamine activity a lot, and they have what's called amphetamine psychosis, which means if a person's really hepped up on amphetamines, they have symptoms that look a lot like schizophrenia. Also, what we know, glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. If it's blocked or suppressed, you get symptoms that look like schizophrenia. One strange thing we have here is that in the brains of people, let me shrink this so you can see better. Move this to, you can see over here on the left, what's called ventricles. These are little gaps, spaces for cerebral spinal fluid that kind of flows around and cushions your brain. If a person has schizophrenia, they have much larger ventricles for this cerebral spinal fluid. So people with schizophrenia, often these are 15% larger. Doesn't happen to every patient with it. And also your book describes a story where a person who does not have schizophrenia has larger ventricles than their twin, their identical twin, who has small ventricles, but they have symptoms of schizophrenia. So it's what we realize is that you're having fewer neurons basically if you have ventricles that are that large, and perhaps that contributes to some of the symptoms we see of schizophrenia. There's evidence that the mom, the pregnant mom, getting infected with the flu or some sort of major virus might influence the odds of a person develops schizophrenia. Yeah. So research shows mothers of people with schizophrenia were more often exposed to the flu while pregnant. Rh factor, A positive, A negative, B positive, B negative. The incompatibility of the mom and the fetus might contribute to it. There's some evidence for that. That the whole oxygen supply during the birthing process could influence. Sometimes little infants get wrapped around the umbilical cord as they're coming out of the womb, and that can choke off oxygen supply. And kids who have that sort of history of birthing complications are increased risk for schizophrenia. And nutritional deficits are a problem. Other viruses might be an issue. Even maternal stress might be a factor. So let's see here. Oh, there's another factor that's connected with schizophrenia, and I'm just describing some of this because we know these are factors that are associated. We just don't even know why. But I think I mentioned this before, that if you have a cursor like on a computer screen that goes up and down, and I ask you to follow it, I can give you eyeglasses to track your eye movements. For most of us, it's going to look like up here at the top, that we're just going to track that little ball as it goes up and down, and it's like fine. A person with schizophrenia who is vulnerable to schizophrenia, their eyes are a little bit more jagged. They're like their tracking is off, and it's not clear why. Um, but it's a real thing. Um, and so that's really strange. Also, I put this picture up here because researchers had parents who had videos of their kids, some of whom grew up to develop schizophrenia, some who did not develop schizophrenia, brought those videos to a lab. Um, those videos were given to masked judges, like people who were watching it, who didn't even know what they were looking at. They said, okay, just watch these kids playing and just tell us what you notice. And consistently, those masked judges, the ones who didn't really know what they were looking at, said, hey, that kid seems to be moving kind of differently than the other kids. And they regularly pointed out the kids who went on to grow up to develop schizophrenia because of their movement anomalies or strangeness. And so there might be some other factor related to moving at an early age that could be a flag, red flag, or an indicator for a risk of developing schizophrenia later on in life. It was horrible for a long time. Psychodynamic theory has a lot of problems, but one of the big things it did is it blamed the moms. It said basically your child has schizophrenia, it's your fault. You raised your kid wrong. That's not good. And it was not supported by research, but it left generations of parents, especially moms, feeling responsible for the fact that their child grew up and developed schizophrenia. Now, the behavioral approach to this is basically like, okay, let's ignore any disorganized behavior, but reward appropriate behavior. That can have a positive impact. Actually, in your book, they talk about token economies, and that is basically given like poker chips every time a patient with schizophrenia in a hospital setting makes their bed, brushes their teeth, takes a shower, shows up to like a meal on time. They're interacting with others, and then they can exchange those poker chips for things like cigarettes or like benefits, things that a patient wants. So those token economies do have a positive effect, but some argue it's never okay to deny a patient like anything that in order for them to get tokens. So it has ethical issues connected with that. I mentioned that thorazine was one of the first and it blocked those D2 receptors. They were the first generation antipsychotics were really good at getting rid of positive symptoms, but the side effects were horrible. You get like Parkinson's like symptoms. So this kind of like shakiness, tardive dyskinesia. It said like 54% of the patients who are on first generation antipsychotics develop tardive dyskinesia, which is typically, read about in your book, involuntary movements of muscles of the face, a lot of lip smacking like that, and contorted facial expressions too, that are side effect of this. And even after a person discontinues the medication, they still have those side effects. So a lot of patients do not want to take these, but they help get rid of positive symptoms. The second generation are better, like clozapine, Spiridol, Seroquel, things like that. It has fewer side effects than the first generation ones. And they work both on positive and negatives, but they're really expensive. And may have some brain tissue loss, but like, I mean, if a person has schizophrenia, they need to be able to access to drugs that don't cause really horrible side effects in them. Other treatments include family therapy, obviously trying to train the family not to do that expressed emotion kind of thing in the home. Really, if a person's going to be offered medications and then being provided housing and hopefully a job, there has to be close monitoring with a case manager on that in order for the person to remain successful. Pardon me. Also, there can just be basic social skills training to those with schizophrenia. Let's see what else we got. I talked about the token economy just a minute ago. And it's always good to educate everyone about what to expect. I mean, even what you've seen in this half-hour presentation I just gave, if more families knew what was included in that and read the chapter from your book, I think there'd be a lot more compassion and understanding about what it might be like to live with this disorder. That's all I'm going to do for today. I hope you learned something.